All right, let's jump right in, shall we? We're doing a deep dive today into Surviving Black Hawk Down. For anyone who hasn't heard, it's that new Netflix docuseries, and it revisits, well, it goes back to the Battle of Mogadishu.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I've heard of this. Seems like everyone's talking about it.
I know, right? And our listeners, I mean, you guys sent us a ton of reviews, like a stack of them. So we're going to dig in and see if it lives up to the hype.
Yeah, looking at these reviews, it seems like it might be, well, a bit more than your typical war documentary, you know?
Totally. It sounds like they're really trying to show the human side of things, not just like focusing on the battles and the tactics.
Yeah, from what I'm seeing here, they're calling it a dual perspective kind of thing.
Right. They don't just tell the story from the American soldiers' point of view. They actually give a voice to the Somalis, too, like the civilians, even some of the militia fighters.
Wow, that's really interesting, because usually you only get one side of the story, right?
Exactly. And it sounds like Surviving Black Hawk Down, it tries to give a more complete picture.
So it's less about good guys versus bad guys, more about just showing the chaos and the human cost for everyone involved.
And from what I'm reading, it sounds like they really put you right there in the thick of it, using all this like archival footage, crazy reenactments, and some really raw, intense interviews.
Oh, yeah. One of these reviews mentioned this really powerful moment. Apparently, they have a Somali mother talking about losing her child in the battle. And then right after that, they cut to an interview with an American soldier. He's talking about like wrestling with, the weight of what he did that day.
Oh, wow. Heavy stuff.
Yeah, it sounds pretty intense. And I'm guessing they don't hold back on the violence either.
So does it, just focus on the fighting, though? What about the bigger picture? Do they talk about the historical and political context at all?
Oh, they do. They do. And that's actually where the series seems to be going a bit deeper than, say, the Black Hawk Down movie. That was mostly just action, action, action.
Oh, right, right.
This docuseries actually takes the time to explain, the Somali Civil War, the UN's involvement, why they were there, and even some of the things that went wrong strategically that led to the mission falling apart.
So they're not just showing what happened, they're trying to explain why it happened.
Exactly. Like how this mission that was supposed to be like a quick in and out thing turned into this 15-hour bloodbath. And it looks like they also get into how this battle actually changed how the U.S. military approached interventions after Vietnam.
Wow, I didn't realize it had that big of an impact.
Yeah, it really shaped their thinking.
Okay, so we've got human stories, historical context, but I gotta ask, since Ridley Scott Associates produced this, I'm guessing they went all out on the production value, right?
They did. They did. Every review mentions how good this thing looks. Like amazing visuals, the pacing is tight, the whole thing. They clearly spent a lot of money making this look good.
But did they, did all that flashiness take away from the actual, the facts and the history?
No, actually, it seems like they found a good balance. Like using the high production value to tell the story better, not to overshadow it. One reviewer specifically mentioned the scene where they show, Gary Gordon and Randy Schuhart, those Medal of Honor recipients, their last stand.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, it sounds like they really recreated that whole scene, like down to the dialogue from the actual transmissions. The reviewer said it was so intense and you really felt their sacrifice,
Wow. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it is. But let's be real. Every documentary is going to have some people who aren't happy with it. So what are some of the criticisms people are bringing up? The main one seems to be the emotional intensity. I mean, it's war. It's going to be brutal. And it sounds like they don't shy away from showing that, at all.
Yeah, some people might find it just too much.
Yeah, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And another thing is, it sounds like if you don't know much about the Battle of Mogadishu already, you might be a little lost. Yeah, a few reviewers said it kind of jumps right in. It assumes you already know the basics of what happened.
So not the best for a casual history buff then?
Probably not. You'd probably want to do some reading first, maybe brush up on Black Hawk Down, the book or something.
Okay, but what about people who do know the story? Any criticisms from them?
Yeah. Actually, there are a few people who felt like it could have been more critical.
Oh, critical how?
Of the U.S. strategy in Somalia. They felt like it focused more on the individual experiences of the soldiers and the Somali people, which is great.
Right.
But they wanted more about the decisions that led to the battle,
Yeah, so the big picture stuff.
Right, were there failures in intelligence? Did they make bad assumptions about the Somali political situation?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's one thing to show the horrors of war, but it's also important to understand how we got there in the first place, right?
Exactly. And that's where some people felt like it fell a little short.
Makes you think even all these years later, people are still debating the best way to approach these kinds of conflicts.
For sure. And this series, even with its flaws, it definitely gets people talking. Makes you figure out that the tough choices that have to be made.
Because it's not just good guys and bad guys, is it?
No, not at all. It's way more complicated, that you have to understand all the different sides, the motivations, the pressures that lead to these decisions.
And sometimes those decisions have terrible consequences, as we see in Surviving Black Hawk Down.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me was how they showed the impact, the lasting effects of the battle on everyone involved.
Yeah, not just the soldiers, but the Somali people, too. It really hits home that war doesn't just end when the fighting stops.
Right, you're left with the scars, the trauma, the families torn apart, and the communities trying to rebuild.
It's a powerful reminder that there's always a human cost, and that cost can last for generations.
It's not just about the people who were there that day either, right? I mean, this battle changed things. Yeah, they touched on how it influenced American foreign policy and how people viewed military intervention.
It's like everything that happened in Mogadishu sent these ripples out and changed the world in ways we might not even realize.
And that's what makes this series so interesting. It's not just looking back at history. It's about how that history still affects us today.
And it makes it feel relevant, even though it's about a battle that happened decades ago.
Definitely, we're still dealing with the same issues today, aren't we? Intervention, nation building, the ethics of war.
Big questions.
Yeah. And while Surviving Black Hawk Down doesn't give you all the answers, it does make you think, look at things from different perspectives and consider the consequences of our actions.
It's a tough watch, but a valuable one.
I think so, yeah. It's challenging, but it's also rewarding.
Yeah.
If you're willing to engage with it.
So after looking at all this, what really stands out to you about this series?
I think for me, it's how they combine everything. The human stories, the history, the ethical questions, and they make it a really immersive experience.
Yeah, it's not just a dry history lesson.
Right. It feels real, like you're there.
And even though it's about this one specific battle, it feels like it has something to say about the world today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are lessons we can learn from Mogadishu, like how important it is to understand different perspectives and how devastating war can be.
Those are definitely lessons that are still relevant today.
It's wild, right? Like all these individual stories woven into this one massive event.
Yeah, and they do such a good job with that. They could have easily just stayed zoomed out, focused on the strategy, the big picture stuff, but they really bring it down to the human level. You see the impact on individuals like, Michael Durant.
The pilot.
Yeah,
the one who got shot down, captured.
Yeah, his story, it's nuts.
Seriously. And they don't sugarcoat it either, you know? They show how brutal his captivity was, but also his incredible will to survive. And that resilience is like a thread throughout the whole series. You see it in the American soldiers and you see it in the Somalis too.
I guess it shows you what humans are capable of, huh? Even when things are at their absolute worst.
Totally. It's pretty inspiring. And, it's not just about survival. It's about the moments of, like, humanity and compassion you see in the middle of all that chaos. It's pretty powerful.
I remember reading about those Somali civilians who, risked their lives to help wounded American soldiers.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you realize that sometimes those lines between us and them, they get blurry,
It's like, at the end of the day, we're all just people.
And then there's the bond between the soldiers, the way they rely on each other, that camaraderie that's forged in the heat of battle.
Yeah, you can't really understand that kind of connection unless you've been through something like that, I guess.
And it's important to remember, it's not just the Americans who felt that, This series does a good job of showing the Somali perspective, too, their camaraderie.
So it's not just a one-sided story.
No, they make an effort to show the Somali side, their motivations, why they were fighting, what they lost. It challenges that whole good versus evil thing.
Yeah, because in war, it's never that simple, is it?
No way. Everyone's got their own story, and it's usually a lot more complicated than you might think. I think that's one of the things this series does so well. It reminds you that everyone has a story.
That's a good point. We tend to forget that sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in our own perspective and forget that everyone else has their own experiences, their own reasons for doing things.
Especially in a world that feels more and more divided every day.
Totally. But this series, it kind of forces you to step outside of your own bubble and see things from another angle. You know? It's a call for understanding, for empathy, for recognizing that we're all connected somehow, even when we're fighting each other.
Powerful stuff. So, to wrap things up, would you say Surviving Black Hawk Down is more than just a war documentary?
Oh, absolutely. It's more about the human condition, the complexities of war,
Mm.
and how even in the darkest times, there's still this hope for peace and understanding.
Yeah, and even though it's about this really heavy, sensitive subject, it sounds like they handle it with a lot of care and respect.
Yeah, for sure. It's a tough watch, but it's also really well done.
Well, I know what I'm watching tonight.
Uh-huh.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. This has been, well, really thought-provoking.
You got it. These kinds of conversations are always so interesting. It makes you realize how much history still affects us today.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there, if you're looking for a documentary that's going to challenge you, move you, and make you think, then definitely check out Surviving Black Hawk Down. It's a story you won't forget,